I remember the moment the cut finally opened inside me, sharp and undeniable, as if something long buried had risen to the surface and demanded to be seen. I had walked into their glittering dining room, still holding the fragile hope that this time they might look at me with something other than dismissal, that maybe the glow of their new chandelier or the velvet shimmer on the chairs might soften them enough to acknowledge the effort I had poured into keeping them afloat. Instead, they barely glanced at me while praising the expensive wine they had imported just for themselves. The whole place smelled of indulgence, sweet and nauseating, while I stood there with the quiet plea I could not say aloud I needed help for a medical bill that kept growing like a shadow behind me. But when I finally spoke, they looked at me as though I had committed an offense. The woman waved a jeweled hand and told me there was no money for such things, not when the upcoming celebration required perfection. The man simply laughed and said I should learn to manage my own life instead of expecting generosity. Their words struck like cold water poured straight into my chest. I noticed the flicker of the candles reflecting on their indifferent faces, the soft hum of an expensive music system masking their disregard, and my own fingers trembling as if the air itself had turned frigid when the woman stood and handed me the bill for the dinner they had just enjoyed, telling me that since I had funded so much of their past comfort, I might as well keep supporting it. Something inside me broke fully. The paper felt heavy in my hands, thick and obscene, the number printed across it glowing like a taunt. It was 3,270, a figure that etched itself into my memory with cruel precision. I could hear my heartbeat louder than the music, feel the sweat gather on my palms, sense the room shrinking around me. They returned to their laughter as though I were invisible. At that instant, I realized the years I had spent offering what little I had meant nothing to them beyond convenience. The crushed hope still lingering in me turned into a cold clarity. The bill, with its glossy surface and absurd demand, became the final object marking the truth I had refused to face. I stepped out of the room carrying that slip of paper like a scar, knowing something fundamental had shifted, knowing the cut would never close the same way again. I walked into the night feeling the weight of every choice that had led me there, and the cool air wrapped around me like a warning I could no longer ignore. As the lights from their house faded behind me, and a strange steadiness rose within me, telling me that the moment of breaking was also the moment of becoming something I had never dared. The days after that moment felt strangely hollow, as if the world had shifted slightly off its axis and I was learning again how to walk inside it. At first I sank into a kind of quiet collapse, moving through hours without feeling the weight of them, my mind circling the same scene, the same cold refusal, the same number on that thick sheet of paper. I would wake with the memory of their laughter pressing against my skull as if it wanted to erase everything that came before. I thought the grief would drag me under because it was not just about money or rejection. It was the slow realization that I had spent years offering pieces of myself to people who had never once looked back to see what it cost me. That understanding hurt more than their words, but somewhere in that numb heaviness a thin line of fierce resolve began to form. Not out of anger, though anger flickered at the edges, but out of the unbearable thought that if I stayed as I was, nothing would ever change, and I would keep drowning silently in debts they never cared to know existed. I started telling myself that I needed to rebuild, not to prove anything to them, but because I wanted to know what my life might look like if I stopped bending toward their expectations. I held on to the image of someone I once loved, someone whose absence had carved a hollow in me, someone who used to tell me that value is not something granted by others but something grown from endurance. That memory lit the smallest spark of movement, so I began doing the tedious things that signaled a new beginning. I signed up for evening classes. Even though I felt out of place among younger people, I took extra shifts at work, staying long after the building had emptied, just to feel the slow, steady climb of earning something that belonged only to me. I saved every small amount, like storing fragments of strength in hidden pockets, choosing simple meals, patching old clothes, avoiding anything unnecessary. Each little decision was a quiet rebellion against the life they had kept me tied to. I started collecting every message, every old receipt, every trace of how I had supported them, tucking these pieces into a folder that grew heavier each week, not out of spite but because documenting the past helped me anchor the truth whenever doubt tried to creep back in. The turning point arrived one evening when my phone lit up with their number, and for the first time, instead of feeling dread or guilt, I felt nothing at all. I watched the screen glow, then fade without lifting a finger, and in that stillness I realized something had shifted permanently. The weight of their influence had loosened its hold. I was no longer orbiting around them. I was stepping onto a path built by my own hands, not steady yet, but undeniably mine. And as that awareness settled over me, a quiet strength unfurled inside me, like a promise I had finally made to myself. Everything I had been building in silence seemed to tighten around me the day their world finally cracked and spilled into mine. It came first as a rumor carried by someone who did not know the history, someone mentioning that the man had lost a major deal and that the debts were spreading faster than anyone could contain. Then came another whisper about an investigation, something involving missing funds and angry investors. I listened without reacting, but inside I felt the faint echo of a shift, as if the ground beneath them had begun to crumble. After years of standing on my shoulders, I did not seek out more details. They arrived on their own, drifting through people who had once praised their success. Now those same voices spoke with a blend of curiosity and pity, saying that the family who had lived in luxury suddenly faced the threat of complete ruin soon after that. The woman reached out asking to meet, and her message carried a forced softness that felt unnatural. I told her to come to my place, choosing my ground deliberately, a small, simple home built from my effort rather than their demands. When they arrived, their posture had changed, the confidence drained from their eyes, replaced with something desperate. It was strange to see them in my space, among the quiet furniture and worn surfaces, still carrying the scent of hard work. They sat across from me, and I waited, letting the silence stretch until they finally spoke. The man tried to command the room as he once did, insisting that everything was temporary and that as their relative I had a duty to support them. But the brittle edge in his voice stripped his words of power. The woman attempted another approach, leaning forward with a trembling smile, saying that I had always been one of them and that families should stay together, especially in difficult times. I watched them both and felt no obligation, no pull of old guilt, only a steady calm shaped by the months I had spent learning who I was without them. Then I placed the folder on the table, the one filled with years of receipts, transfers, and records of the sacrifices they had never acknowledged. Their eyes widened, as if the weight of those pages could crush the image they had tried so long to project. I told them that I knew the truth about the payments made in my name, payments meant for my well-being, that had been redirected to fund their luxuries. Their faces paled at the revelation. It landed between us like a stone, shattering the last of the illusions they had used to control me. The woman whispered a denial, but her voice cracked. The man tried to rise but sank back down, as if the truth had rooted him to the chair. I spoke quietly, telling them that the support they had claimed to provide was a fiction, and that the funds had been meant for me long before I was old enough to understand. Their silence grew heavy until it filled the room, pressing against all of us, and in that moment I felt the balance shift completely. I was no longer the one standing outside their world begging for recognition. They were the ones sitting in mine, waiting for a Mercy I did not owe them. I let the silence linger a little longer, letting them feel the full weight of the truth before I spoke again, and when I finally did, my voice felt steadier than I expected. I told them I understood exactly what they wanted from me, that they had come not out of love or connection, but because the walls around them were collapsing and they needed someone to hold them up again. They shifted uneasily as if the chairs beneath them had turned unstable. The woman asked what it would take for me to help, and the question itself felt like a door creaking open toward a future I never imagined. I looked at them both and said the words slowly so they could not pretend to misunderstand. I told them I would consider helping with the immediate crisis, paying the overdue amount that threatened to take their last remaining property, but only if they agreed to something they had never allowed themselves to face. I told them they would have to sit in front of me and state clearly, without twisting the truth, that they had used money meant for my care to fund their comfort, that they had chosen clothes, trips, dinners, and status over the basic needs of someone they claimed to value. They stared at me as if I had spoken in impossible language. The man scoffed, first calling my demand dramatic, but the sound rang hollow with none of the authority he once wielded. The woman reached for gentleness again, saying that families should not air such harsh words, yet she avoided my eyes as if she knew those words had always been hers to say. They began to argue with each other, then with me, shifting blame, twisting stories, trying to shrink the truth into something small enough to escape. But the more they scrambled, the clearer it became that they no longer controlled the narrative. I watched them and felt something inside me settle firmly into place, a quiet understanding that the power balance had turned completely toward me. I repeated my offer one more time, calm and unmoving. I said I would give them the exact amount needed, not more, not less, if they acknowledged their choices without excuses. They fell silent this time, truly silent, as if the truth itself had risen and filled the space between us, pressing in until they had no room to breathe. The man finally muttered something about pride and reputation, but the woman knew better. She looked at me with a trembling sort of acceptance, realizing that this was the only lifeline left. She nodded slowly and whispered that they would do it, though the words scraped out of her like something painful and unfamiliar. I told them that when the day came I would make everything public, not to humiliate them but to ensure there would be no more manipulation, no more quiet rewriting of history. They froze at that, each of them picturing the circle of acquaintances, relatives, and friends who would witness their confession. The fear in their eyes was sharp, but beneath it I sensed something else, the faint unraveling of the power they once wrapped around me. I stood and they followed, as if guided by an older instinct, one that no longer served them. And as I walked them to the door, I felt not triumph but a strange stillness, knowing that the rules of our world had shifted forever and I was the one setting them now. The moment their downfall finally surfaced felt unreal, as if the world held its breath, waiting for the last thread to snap around them. News drifted toward me like scattered ashes carried by a fading wind, telling me that their polished image had cracked under the pressure of debts, accusations, and the sudden departure of those who once pretended loyalty. I watched from a distance, feeling a calm separation where fear, guilt, and longing used to live. The final scene began inside a crowded room filled with murmuring voices, cameras poised, and faces hungry for the truth they had buried for years. I stepped into the space with steady breaths, grounding myself as they stood under the harsh lights, looking smaller than I had ever seen them. The woman trembled as whispers rippled through the crowd, reminding her of every story she once controlled, now spiraling beyond her reach. The man tried to maintain the last fragments of pride, but his voice quivered when the floor seemed to tilt beneath him. I held the evidence in my hands, the collected proof that their comfort had been built on my deprivation, and the room leaned closer. When I placed each page before them, their faces drained of color as words once weaponized against me returned like a storm, stripping away every excuse they had rehearsed. The woman tried to speak, but the sound collapsed into a thin gasp that revealed more truth than any confession. The man attempted denial until the crowd demanded answers and his shoulders sagged under the weight of his own creation. I said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence widen until they finally acknowledged what they had done, draining themselves of the last illusion they clung to. The confession slipped from them, raw, shaky, and trembling through the air like something torn free from a place they never meant to open. Gasps rose around us as the truth settled, heavy and undeniable, leaving them exposed in a way they had feared more than losing their wealth. The collapse that followed unfolded quickly, their remaining supporters turning away, their carefully crafted stories dissolving into whispers of betrayal, cruelty, and greed. I watched their eyes dim as they realized there was no rescue, no narrative to twist, no hand left to pull them from the wreckage of their choices. Yet inside me there was no triumph, only a quiet, hollow release, as if the ground beneath my feet had finally stopped shaking. I felt a soft, unsteady breath move through me, carrying a strange mix of sorrow, clarity, and something close to peace. Their downfall was never the victory I wanted, it was simply the end of a story that had held me captive for far too long. I walked away feeling the truth finally settling inside me. When the echoes of that final collapse began to fade, I found myself standing in a life stripped of the noise that had once pulled me in every direction, and for the first time the quiet did not frighten me. It felt like open space, like a horizon widening instead of a wall closing in. I no longer carried their shadows or their expectations, and the freedom of that realization moved through me with a gentle, unfamiliar warmth. I began rebuilding, not from desperation but from intention, choosing actions that felt like small seeds planted into soil I had finally claimed as my own. I used a portion of what was rightfully mine to create a fund designed for people who had once stood where I had stood, those who had been drained by the very families meant to shelter them, those who needed a hand not in charity but in recognition of their endurance. Each time I approved a request, I felt something inside me settle, a piece of the past dissolving into purpose. I also allowed myself to return to the dream I had buried long ago, the one I abandoned because they insisted it was foolish. I walked into a quiet studio one afternoon and felt my breath catch as I touched the tools that once felt like extensions of my hands. I worked slowly, at first clumsy, uncertain, but as the days passed the movements returned, carrying with them a sense of belonging I had not felt in years. My circle shifted too. I built something that resembled a family, from people who showed up not out of expectation but because they chose to be there, people who stayed late to share stories, people who celebrated every small breakthrough, people who never asked me to shrink so they could shine. I did not erase the past, but I no longer let it guide me. I thought about forgiveness and understood it in layers. I knew I could not return to them or invite them into the new world I was building, but I also no longer felt the sharp edge of anger. I held a quiet, distant kind of forgiveness, the kind that asks for nothing in return and simply loosens the grip of old wounds so they no longer decide who I become. Still, I kept a boundary, a firm, calm line, knowing they could not cross it again. The final shift happened one morning when I stepped outside and felt the light settle on me in a way that felt both new and familiar, as if I were seeing my life without the distortion of their influence. I realized then that the scars would always remain, but they no longer pulsed with pain. They stood instead as quiet reminders of strength, markers of how far I had traveled. I closed my eyes and let the air move through me like an unspoken promise, knowing that the story ahead was mine, entirely shaped by choice, resilience, and the kind of hope that grows only after Everything has been burned down and rebuilt from the inside out.